What's going on, people? Hopefully this will be a short video. And I just want to speak briefly about the so-called Black Americans versus the Africans from the continent. Now, it's sickening to sit back and watch the so-called black people, and I hate using the term black, but it's sickening watching black people, American blacks, that's being tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine. And I spoke on this in videos of the past about how black people are always changing. They're black, they're Afro-American, they're African-American, they're Moors, they're Hebrew Israelites, they're Africans, they're Native Americans, and every time they switch doctrines, they gotta try to switch attires. Now, what I want to discuss is the relationship between the so-called blacks in America and the Africans from the continent. Now, myself personally, I've met a couple of nice Africans, but for the most part, those from the continent do not accept black Americans as their people. There are Africans that straight up tell you that we are not the same, but black Americans refuse to hear that. And constantly, it's like you're always begging to be accepted. Now, according to history, and there's different types of versions out there, but according to history, it was the so-called African from the continent that sold your ancestors into captivity. Now, I don't ever recall any Africans from the continent sending any warplanes, ships, boats, what have you. I don't ever recall them sending for us to help us. Never. Now that the civil rights movement passed and we fought, we bled, we died, many of us was hanged by the neck, had dogs sicked on us, sprayed down with water hose, crosses burned in our yard, all types of horrific torture and punishment that the so-called black Americans went through. And now the Africans come here from the continent and you want to kiss their behinds. And they actually give you their behinds to kiss. Now, I commented on a video a few minutes ago. Dr. Mumby, I think that's her name. I like her. She's cool. She's got a good personality. I like her spirit. But in her dialogue, she was talking about how Africans are being treated in various countries and how they're not received, and how like this one African was beat down in India. And she was saying that Africans globally need to come together. Now, that sounds good. That sounds good to the average person, but my thoughts are like this. Why all of a sudden now the so-called Africans want to come together? Why all of a sudden now you want our help to fight your struggles when we have struggles of our own to fight and we get no help, no assistance, no nothing from you? I don't ever recall any Africans, and if they were, I didn't see them, but I don't recall any Africans out there with their fist in the air saying Black Lives Matter. I don't recall them, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives. I don't recall that. I don't recall any Africans out there protesting when these young black African Americans, or whatever you prefer to call yourselves, I don't ever recall them out there protesting when they were shot down the street like animals. I don't recall that. Now, white people was out there and other nationalities was out there, but I ain't see no Africans out there. Okay? Now, if I'm wrong, correct me on that. Okay? Because I can take correction. You know what I mean? I don't mind being corrected. If I'm wrong in something, don't be afraid. It's how you do it. It's not so much as what you say, it's how you do it. Right? But I don't recall any Africans joining with the so-called Black American struggles. I don't recall seeing that at all. But I commented on that video, and this dude responded and told me that I was being divisive. And I only made a comment. He said I was being divisive and we are the same because I said that, we're not the same. There is a distinction between us. And he said that there's no distinction. Well, there is, right? And then, of course, he came back, well, I'm not going to argue with you. Well, is that what you call arguing? Me responding to a comment that you wrote on something that I posted, and now you say you don't want to argue, but yet you came at me like that? So, but that's how a lot of these beta males are, in America, right? So my question to him was, okay, well, since you are the same, and since there's no distinction between you, what part of Africa are you from? What part of the continent are you from? And I have to say continent because you have ignorant Black Americans that come back, and even whites that come back, well, Africa is the continent, right? That's all you know about it. So that's why when somebody say Africa, like, well, it's the continent. So the continent, right? So if there's no distinction between the blacks here in America and the Africans in the continent, then I'm sure that on a regular basis you visit your family. What part of the continent are you from? And who's your family in Africa, since there's no distinction? I'm sure you have connections in the continent. And I'm not talking about connections off the internet, people that you refer to as your family. I'm not talking about what you get from Ancestry.com or these DNA tests that you take, that you spit on something and send it back in the mail. I'm not talking about that. You should have some grandparents, some cousins, some nieces, some aunts, some nephews. You should be able to speak the language. You should be able to have their last name, since there's no distinction. You should have the same history past that they have, and they should have the same history past that you have, since there's no distinction in you and those in the continent. And those in the continent don't mind calling you an Akata. They want nothing to do with you. And if you say that they are black, they would tell you there are Africans that I have heard them say that they are not black. That's an insult to them to refer to them as black, because they want to make sure that there's a distinction between you and them. So I want to ask you guys, whoever see this video, and share this video. Is there a distinction between the so-called Black Americans and the so-called Africans from the continent? Do you see yourself as the same as they are? And if you are the same, could you answer those questions for me? Who's your people? And how often do you contact those family members of yours in the continent? I'm sure you know some that's still alive and well and living, since there's no distinction at all. And I'm sure you guys have the same history past, the same culture, since there's no distinction, right? So, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, there's a difference. We're not the same. We are not the same. Those are not my people. Now, again, like I said, I've met some Africans that were quite nice. They were nice, but they still had their beliefs, the same upbringing, what their parents taught. Because there's Africans, their parents will tell you that they don't even want them to even marry the so-called Black Americans, because they have their perception of what kind of people you are. So they don't even want to marry or bear children with you. Now, every now and then, you may find a black female that will marry an African dude, but there's going to be a culture crash there. I mean, I'll be surprised. There's maybe like one or two that they may tell you that it's lovely. But when you really sit down and be honest and talk with them, then the distinctions are going to come out. They're going to talk about how they really feel about her being a so-called black American or him being a so-called black Americans. All right. So there is a distinction between the two. There is. All right. In my opinion, in my humble opinion, and I care less what anybody else say out there. All right. So tell me, is there a distinction between the so-called blacks in America or the so-called Africans from the continent that now all of a sudden want to come here to this country and now we are family? We're family, but where were you when our ancestors were going through the most horrific torture and abuse and murders? Where were you then? So feedback, tell me what you think. Until next time. I'm just thinking out loud.